Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Looks like we have 11 people so far, or 10-ish.
Oh, I was muted that whole time. Big introduction and everything. And my microphone was cut. Okay, welcome to our very first session of DevCasts, where we do some live coding, kind of podcast style. So I'm excited to kick this off with Tanner Linsley. Thanks for joining us, Tanner. Do you want to introduce yourself for a second here?
Yeah, you bet. Big fan. Happy to be here. I build open source software, a lot of it for React. I love React and JavaScript. I have a startup called nozzle.io. It's also the website, and we reverse engineer Google. It's basically what we do for businesses to know where they rank on Google and stuff like that. Yeah, I also made React Query, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And yeah, I'm super excited.
Cool. I'm just going to set up my headphones because I think my microphone's echoing. So let me get these set up here. And okay, let's test the sound. Nate, can you give us a test? Oh, no. In my ear is good, but I don't think it'll push through. So let me do this. Multi-output. Okay, try one more time.
Can you hear me now? Is it good? Good in chat as well for everyone on Twitch.
Nope, not there yet. I was wondering about that. Okay. Give us 1 second. This is why it's good to do these things live, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to do this. I won't be able to use those, so I'll just have to mute my microphone as you guys are speaking. And Nate, you and I can, behind the scenes, come up with a better solution for the next session. So, okay. Thanks for helping us out, Twitch folks, and for your patience. We'll go ahead and jump into this. So Tanner, can you tell us a little bit about React Query, since that's what we're looking into today?
For sure. React Query at the most basic level is a way to fetch asynchronous data in a React application. It makes it easy by taking care of kind of all the difficult things you have to think about when fetching asynchronous data. So anytime you're fetching data from a server, you have to think about caching and cache invalidation. You have to make sure that you're invalidating it when you should, and questions around how long do you cache that data, and how do you make sure that it's up to date to your users. And that's difficult to do as well because you don't necessarily own that data yourself. You're just kind of getting a copy from the server and hoping that it's up to date. So React Query has a bunch of mechanisms that help you handle all of that messy stuff.
Cool. Yeah, that is that can get very messy. I've tried to implement caching and validating your cache, and yeah, it gets pretty complicated. And I've been able to play with React Query quite a bit in the last couple months here, and I really love the solution you've come up with. Let me share my screen here. We can what we want to do is, I've got a project built where we're fetching data from the NASA API, and I'd like to implement React Query into this project. So let me share my screen. Once my computer decides to catch up to me, there we go. All right, so this project fetches the NASA photo of the day, so the APOD API endpoint. For those of you watching, this is the repository we're going to be working on. So you have access to that. And we're going to be on a branch called React Query. So you can check out to that branch when we're done and take a look at the code that we write here. So pretty straightforward. When the component mounts, we fetch the photo of the day, the astronomy photo of the day for today. Then we've got this calendar input here where we can fetch a new photo from a specific date, like that.
Nice.
So let's jump into this. Let me bring this up in Visual Studio Code, and the app has some state up here. So we've got our start date, which is today's date. We've got our URL. We've got an isFetching piece of state to kind of give us that state machine concept, and same with our error here. Then when our component mounts, we are using this effect hook to fetch that data and set our APOD state for our details and image components. So I imagine most of what we're going to be doing is going to be right here, but can you kind of talk through, just looking at this basic setup, what do you think React Query could help with here?
Well, so this setup is actually awesome. Most people who, not only people who are starting out writing React, but even people who've been writing React for years, it is so easy to end up right here where you are right now, managing everything with React. And this isn't necessarily bad. if you were just fetching this photo just one time, or if it wasn't changing a whole lot, right? Using an effect to go and get data and setting the state is very, very typical and pretty safe, right? It's when things start to scale bigger and you start fetching more pictures like your app is doing. And also, if you do this in a couple of places inside of your app, you're going to notice you're writing kind of the same boilerplate to do all of this over and over again. And that isn't bad at first, but it might get annoying later. You might even build your own little custom hook to kind of do all this for you. Some of those exist too. But out of the box, React Query is going to get rid of a lot of this state machine boilerplate that we have going on here. Like, is it fetching? Is it not? Do we set an error, right? There's also questions that we're not handling inside of here, like what if the photo changes before we're done fetching the last one? So now we have race condition stuff that we would have to handle inside of here. So even things that you wouldn't normally think about, it's also going to be handling as well. So you'll see that a lot of this is going to get condensed down into just a few lines, to be honest.
Man, that sounds awesome. I'm all about deleting code.
Yeah.
And I think in the details, let's see, not details image. Maybe it was details. Okay, yeah. So here we've got another base URL. So we're calling set URL to trigger that effect to run again and fetch a new image based on whatever URL or whatever date we pick. So we do have a little bit of kind of repeated code that we're doing here. So let's jump into app.js and very first thing, let's install React Query. So duplicate my tab here. And I'm going to run npm.
This is a good moment too to say that there is a new version of React Query coming out at the time of this podcast, coming out soon. But for today, we're just going to be working with the 1.x version.
Yeah, and I think when we, by the time we finish, if we have some time, we can preview that real quick too. Because I got to take a look at that. It looks cool.
Yeah, not very many things are changing. And most of the stuff we're going to be doing today isn't going to be changing either. So.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so as that installs, wish we could still use, we could still use Yarn, but it just goes a lot faster. Here we go. I should get like clown music. Okay. I see your name there. So please, please consider sponsoring React Query and its development. This is open source work that Tanner does not get paid for. He just wants to contribute to the community. So please consider sponsoring. There you go. There's your plug.
All right, thanks, man.
Oh, I was muted, huh? Just yell at me if I'm not talking for a minute.
I thought I was muted too. Sometimes I accidentally hit mute on my touch bar, and I don't even know it.
So let's jump into the docs, and we can see what we're going to import, and then we can jump back here and start implementing this.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're going to look up the React Query docs here. And it's housed right here in GitHub. So, Tanner, do you want to just show me where to get started here?
Yeah, so you can go past the examples. If you're just getting started on your own, be sure to check out some of the examples. We got our sponsors right there that help me keep React Query going. And then our docs start off here. So there's an installation link right there. Why don't we just click that one? Installation, pretty straightforward. You just did most of the work. You just use npm or yarn and add React Query. And then you'll notice really big right after installation, defaults to keep in mind. These are important things that I've learned people need to know before you just start diving into React Query. You know, and I say this to help people out that React Query is configured with aggressive but sane defaults, meaning they err on the side of being very up to date, keeping your data up to date. Sometimes at the cost of fetching data often and invalidating data quite a bit. And these are all things that you can change, but out of the box, that's how it runs. So the first thing to remember is that when you focus off of the browser and then click the browser again, it's going to trigger a refetch. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Anytime you focus the browser, it kind of does a kind of jump starts it again and saying, hey, let's make sure everything's up to date. And then the other thing to remember is that by default, all query data is immediately marked as stale. So the second that we load it, we're going to consider it stale and that we can update it basically if we need to. And the other thing to remember too, probably the three most important ones are the queries will be retried 3 times if they encounter errors. So, and that's that 4th bullet point right there. So if you remember those 3 things when you're starting out with React Query, it might save you some weirdness when you're trying to debug. You're like, whoa, why is my query running 3 times? I only told it to run once. You know, it's like, oh, it's retrying automatically. You know, it's like, why is my stuff reloading when I click on the browser window? Well, it's designed to do that. So keep these things in mind, and they'll help you understand how to debug.
Yeah, I had a stream that you saw a month and a half ago, where I was asking that same question. I saw that it kept refetching, and I was like, what the heck? And then you tweeted at me that this exact section. So I appreciate pointing that out, and a little embarrassed that I missed it when I was going through it first. I think oftentimes we just see, here's my installation, now what do I, and then we look for code right away. So Thanks for calling that out, that this is important to take a look at.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's grab this import and jump back into our code here. So we're going to import use query from React Query, and as it shows here, we're going to pass in a couple arguments, and it's going to return probably an object to us, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Here's a little more fleshed out example.
Yeah.
So let's make our first query for this APOD data.
Okay.
So if you want to walk me through as if we're pair programming, I'll drive and you can
Sure.
talk me through what to do.
Yeah. Let's keep all of this stuff around and just slowly move it into React Query. How does that sound?
Perfect.
So I would start right here with a use query. Let's just paste in the example. Actually, we can modify it from there. So we've got that. Yeah, exactly. So that first thing you're passing in a use query is it's a query key. It's something that uniquely identifies the data that we're fetching. And it looks like the data that we're fetching is, let's see, set APOD URL. Somewhere in here, we probably have something that's uniquely identifying the picture that we're fetching, right?
Yeah, I think so. This endpoint doesn't have it, but because it defaults to today's date if you don't have the today query.
And that's fine. So if we wanted, we could just name this query like today's picture or something. It could be any string you want to uniquely identify whatever we're doing. Yeah, it could just be APOD. That's perfectly fine. And then that second thing you're passing to use query is the function that is going to go and get whatever this data is.
Quick question, Tanner, on that string, the first argument, I'm sure this is jumping the gun a little bit, but as someone who hasn't used your library as much but wants to learn more, that's to be used later to access that by that unique identifier in data?
Yeah, it's used to do a lot of things. So that's the key that it's cached on. So that's the reason that it needs to be unique to whatever data it is that you're fetching. So caching is the first thing. And second of all, yes, if you want to manually get at the data somewhere else in the application, you can use that key to do so. And then the other really important one too is if we ever want to manually refetch this query from somewhere else in the application, we're going to want to know that key as well.
Cool.
In fact, it's very common for those keys to kind of be treated as constants throughout your application.
Right.
Things that don't change. Yeah. So,
okay, we did have a question come in on Twitch real quick.
Sure.
Little unrelated. He asks, use query is definitely cool. Any opinions on relay? So if you want to give just a 30-second opinion on relay, if you have one, and then we can move back to this example.
I haven't used relay myself. I know that it's very tailored to GraphQL. It was built for Facebook, so it's built for like massive projects. I don't think that a majority of people would need something like relay. I mean, there are really big organizations using React Query just fine. Off the top of my head, I know that Walmart is using React Query extensively. I know that Google, I have tons of installs from Google every day. So, you know, there's definitely use cases for these bigger, badder server-side state management libraries. But for the most part, I've never needed them, and I doubt that most others would need them as well, unless you're Facebook or GitHub or something like that.
Cool.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Good answer.
Okay, so we're talking about the second argument now. This is, you said this is basically an async function that we're going to pass in here. So what do we do? What are we going to do next here?
So we need to find the piece of all of this, the piece that's actually going out and fetching our data. And my best guess is it's probably this right here, down to the set APOD, maybe all of this right here. And, you know, we could start with just moving that into that function. And in fact, I could drive here for a second and kind of show you what I mean.
Sure, go for it.
If we just cut this out, and we can actually just inline this, which is kind of cool about React Query. You don't have to define this function, you know, outside of your component or anything. You can just inline it right here.
Nice.
And it can be async, just like that.
Oh, cool.
Nice. And it looks like we're going to need our URL in there. And that's probably going to need to be up here above our query so that we have access to it. And start date, end date. Looks like we're not using that, right? Not yet, at least.
Yeah, not yet.
And this other stuff, let's just comment this out for now. All this APOD stuff. In fact, we're just going to focus on this now. So we've kind of, this is the most important part of all of that we kind of just ripped out. the rest of it that's left, you can kind of see is just kind of the boilerplate, like, setting states, handling errors, and actually calling the effect. What we've done is we've taken out the part that actually fetches our data, and we put it into this asynchronous function. And what all we need to do in this asynchronous function is return a promise. And we're already using async right here. So that's going to cover that for us. So this function is already returning a promise, and we are going to await this fetch call to this URL. And then I'm actually really glad that you're using fetch right here and not something like Axios. And well, I use Axios, and I like Axios more for this reason, but I'm glad that you're using fetch so we can talk about this little situation right here, where if you're using fetch, you have to manually inspect the status code to know if you should, raise an error or not. And that's really important because if you encounter errors in your query, you need to throw them inside of this function. So what we can do here is, instead of setting a pod like we were before with this state, we're just going to return the data, just like that. So after we fetched our data and we made sure that it's not an error, we're just going to return it to our query.
Now to what you said a second ago, you're probably about to cover this, but React query requires us to throw that error if there is an error.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Exactly. And
which is what you're about to cover, I'm sure.
Yeah, tools like Axios and even some GraphQL clients, they'll automatically detect, non-200 status codes and throw those as errors. So most of the time with clients, you don't need to worry about doing this. But if you're using fetch directly, this is something you need to worry about. And so in this else block right here, where we know we have a non-200 error, it's great to destructure the error, and we don't even need to console log it right here. We can just throw that error like that.
Nice.
And React query is going to handle the rest. As you can see, there's status, data, and error. So this data right here is going to get returned into that slot. And this error, if it exists, will get returned into that slot. And then our status kind of tells us what happened, right?
Oh, that's so cool. That is, it's so clean.
That is clean.
That's a really great start to. So now, in fact, all of this is fetching and logging and all this timeout stuff. Well, did you have the timeout there just to simulate?
Yeah, just to. I like the Saturn spinner, so it looked cool.
Let's simulate that. Actually, I like that. We can await a new promise right here, and just do a set timeout to resolve it. So, we'll wait for 2 seconds before fetching.
Yeah, I think that'll help us really kind of visualize what React query is doing for us.
Yep, and this is, handle success, and this is handle errors. Throw errors, really. Yeah, so this is the part, none of this is boilerplate. Like this kind of is with fetch a little bit, but I mean, this is all work. This isn't going to be the same for everything. You might be getting data from a different server or whatever. So React query kind of takes care of all this, and we can actually just get rid of that now. The error and the fetching, it looks like we might need that start date for later. So I'm going to put that up there.
Cool. Well, it's already a lot cleaner. So
this looks great. I mean, it was great before too because it worked, right?
There's so much less code, and that's including our extra little promise to show the spinner.
And it's not always about having less code either. It's about being able to reason about what's going on, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You don't want to have to think about some things, but there are things that you do want to have to reason about, and that's the important stuff is, well, where am I getting the data, and error handling and actually manipulating the data, and the rest of it just kind of hides behind here. So
cool. So use query, when we call use query, is this going to fetch our data right away then when this component mounts?
it is, because it has everything that it needs to start working. It's got a query key, and it has an asynchronous function. So it's just going to start working.
Awesome. Okay, so when we get our data back, before we had the apod state, which we were passing down to both our image and our details component.
Yep.
So we've lost our set URL, so let's go ahead and delete this one. We still have our start date and set start date, but we no longer have...
But we actually didn't lose our set URL, actually. That's still up there.
Oh, you're right. Yep, good point. Okay, so we've got now, instead of apod, is it...
Well,
it should just be exactly data, right?
Apod before is data. They're the same thing. It's just a naming of it. So something we can do here is we can just destructure data into apod.
Oh, nice. Okay, well, this should be, by all accounts, it should be up and running, right? Should we go check it out?
Yeah, we might be missing a few things. I already know what they are, but if you want to try it out right now, we can.
Okay.
I think it'd be a great learning experience to take it incrementally.
Nice.
Perfect. So I'm going to pull this up and... Oh, there we go. A few things are not defined.
If we had linting on, it would have actually showed us that pretty quick. That is fetching right here is undefined.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so, and where are those at? Those, oh, here we go. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So this was our state machine kind of setup that we had. If we're fetching data, we want to show the Saturn loader and our message. So how do we... This is now built into status, correct?
Exactly. So that is fetching can just turn into status equals loading.
Nice.
So
is it loading, right?
Yep, loading. And actually, in the next version, I think this is a great time to outline some of the things that are coming in the next version. You'll actually have an is loading boolean that you can use as well.
Nice.
So you could go either way. Some people like enums like this. Some people like the booleans, and I think there's use cases for both. So, but for now, for version 1, status equals loading.
Is for version 2, is there going to be a boolean in addition to the string status, or is it a replacement?
Yes, it's an addition. So you'll be able to go either way. There's some people who like dealing with things, in state machine fashion, enum style, and there's booleans. The booleans are based off of the enum, so they're guaranteed to never overlap. That's the important part. You would never have is loading and is error. That doesn't make sense. So.
True. I love it. That's awesome.
And similarly, this error right here, this would work, but it's kind of nice to know to key it off of the state instead. So I would actually suggest doing this where the status of the query is in an error status, and then using the error variable. What that does is, maybe your function threw an error, but that error is null or something weird. Like you can throw something that is a nullish or falsy. And so we would want React Query to kick us into this state regardless of what that error object is.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool.
Nice.
Okay.
Yeah, the only one left is that we have data. So.
Well, let's try it out. So, are we saved here? Save that file. Start date. Oh, let's just go pull those back in.
Comment it. Awesome.
I just did, so we can keep cruising.
Okay, there. Oh, look at that. Let me refresh and see. Okay, so there's our loading state. Beautiful. That's so cool.
Hey, you know what? I have something fun we should do right now as well.
Please say DevTools.
Let's do it.
Yes. DevTools, let's install them. It's like the first thing that I do with everything.
Okay, I have not done this. I've seen them on your examples, so I've never actually done this on my own. Is it here in the same documentation?
There is a section in the docs that talk about installing the DevTools. In fact, if you just find on the page DevTools, yeah.
Okay.
Click on that link and
this one? Oh, it's a repo. Okay, cool. Okay, I'll go through the install here. And we just install this right into our project, right?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm gonna turn my fan on here. You guys let me know if it makes too much noise.
Okay.
Sure. Just out of curiosity, what was the reason for doing a straight install per project over like an extension in the browser or something like that?
The first one was that I don't know how to build a browser.
It's fair.
After investigating what it takes to build that browser extension, I did not want any part of it.
Sure.
I looked at how others were built, and it was just insanely mind-boggling. You know, there's weird like serialization layers and event buses, and I just didn't. I wanted something to ship, you know, like really fast, and to have it be tiny and be able to keep it up to date easy. So I just built a component. Like I did what I know how to do best. I built a React component. I made it so that you can include it in your project and it will just magically disappear in production. You don't have to worry about it. So yeah, you'll read right here. You can just include it directly in your project, and in production, it's just a placeholder file with nothing in it. So it doesn't
nice.
That's really cool. Are we going to follow this right here?
Yep.
Very cool.
Okay.
So yeah, just import React Query DevTools right there, that whole first line.
And then just display it anywhere, render it anywhere.
You don't need the initial is open here. We can get rid of that when we put it in. The docs right there say to render it as high up in your app as possible.
Okay, I think that's as high as we can get.
Yep.
All right, so let's open this back up. Oh, not that one. This one. And hey, look at that. We've got the little DevTools icon. So let me close this down and bring up this.
Nice.
So the DevTools are pretty simple. It just shows you a list of all of your unique queries on the left with their query keys. And it has some color coding to show you, you know, is it fetching, is it stale, fresh, whatever. Yeah, and then it has this details bar on this view on the right where you can manually refetch it or remove it or whatever. And then an actual data explorer that you can see what's inside of the cache itself. And then this query explorer is the actual query object inside of React Query that you can get a little bit more information about the query itself.
And these are the configure kind of the things we talked about a little bit ago, where it retries 3 times if it runs into an error state, or it will
default stale time is 0. By default, it caches everything for I think 5 minutes, something like that. Yep, that's cool. How you can see all the config that was used to create this query. So reload the page here. It will save the state of this and stay open as we reload the page. And you'll notice the fetching blue turning into the stale yellow as you reload the page. You can see the state change.
Hmm.
And that fetching stale at the top, that's for all queries. If you look at that little line, there's another yellow box right there. That's the exact state of this query.
Okay, that makes sense.
Nice.
So you've got this fresh box. Is there any time that React Query considers data as fresh?
Absolutely. So by default, everything gets marked as stale immediately, and that's because we err on the side of staying up to date all the time. But if we were to set a stale time that was higher for a query, we could do it right now, actually. If you pop back into app, head over to the query, as the third argument right here, we can pass a configuration object.
Cool.
And one of those options is stale time.
Is that also where we could set like the cache invalidation time and stuff like that?
Yep. So stale time is how much time it's going to, how long we're going to consider this data fresh, that it doesn't need
Cool.
to be updated. So we could do it for 5 seconds and update it. And let's head back to our app now and reload the page.
Cool.
So you see we went from fetching to fresh, and after 5 seconds, it's going to get marked as stale.
Now, is there anything that I, as a developer, need to know about the state of data being fresh or stale, or is that just internally for React Query to know when to refetch data? What does this do for me, I guess?
You do need to know a little bit about it, but not all the time. So a good way to think about it is that if we had 2 separate tabs, and one of them was showing our picture of the day and one of them was showing something else, if we loaded up our picture of the day tab with a stale time of 0 and then navigated to the other tab and then came back, then it would still show that photo that we have cached, but it would immediately go and fetch it again from the server because it's considered stale. So it refetches it in the background. Now consider the other situation where if we were caching the photo for 10 seconds and we went to another tab and then we came back to the photo within those 10 seconds, it wouldn't go out and refetch the data in the background because we're still considering the data fresh.
Okay, and I think that's something we can try out here. So if I go to, this is stale data now. So if I click off of this tab and click back, we're fetching.
Yep, and you're still seeing the photo while you're fetching because it's showing you the cached version.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. So I'm going to do that again, but as soon as it turns to fresh, I'm going to jump out for less than 5 seconds, and it will not refetch.
Yeah.
So we're fetching.
You got 5 seconds. You come back.
Still fresh, so we don't refetch that at all.
It didn't refetch yet.
But now that it's stale, now it will. Exactly. Whew, that is so cool.
So the stale time, a good way to think about stale time is, how long are you willing to let this data be potentially out of date from the server, right? If you're fetching something like a Pokemon from a Pokédex, that Pokemon data is likely to never change, right? So you could set the stale time to an absurd amount of time. You can even set it to infinity and say that you never want it to become stale, and it will never refetch, right? But if you're working with something like a chat window, where new chats could be coming in at any moment, really, you want your stale time to be pretty low and possibly just 0, right?
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Or if you've got an office of maybe your software is used by hundreds of people at the same company, and they're, I don't know, 5 different employees are adding data to the same database, then you would want those refreshes happening more often because chances are since the time you fetch that data, someone else in that company has added more data to the database or updated it or changed it.
Yeah. Now, that's another interesting thing you just brought up, is that data that's changing constantly all the time. You'll notice that our astronomy photo here, it's already stale right now. So the photo we're looking at is stale. It's an out-of-date photo. If that photo was changing every 10 seconds, we wouldn't be seeing the most up-to-date photo. Now, head back to the app, back to our query configuration, and I'll show you guys one more trick. So we can set a stale time back to 0 so that it's always considered out of date. And then we could do something called an interval. And we can set it to 5 seconds. And if we head back to our app, we'll see what that interval does for us. So it fetches, it automatically becomes stale because our stale time is 0. But every 5 seconds, it's going to go and fetch a new version.
Beautiful. That was my big remaining question.
There was a comment on Twitch that someone said kind of like a trading app. A trading app would be a great example for this. You always want the most up-to-date data.
Yeah, exactly.
Ah, cool. We've got just about 10 minutes left. So
Probably the best parts.
What's that?
We haven't even covered the best parts.
I know. I wanted to work with that choosing a new date, but I think we can kind of push that aside because that's all fetching data.
There is one principal part of that we could go over.
Sure.
Like, we don't even need to necessarily make, unless it's wired up to work right now. Is it? I'm not sure.
It was, yeah. When URL changes, then it would fetch a new picture.
Set URL. Oh, I see. Perfect. Yeah, I mean, we can set that up for you if you'd like. It would be actually pretty easy.
Sure.
Is the URL possible to update right this minute in the app?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if we go to so where set URL is being called is image details.
Okay.
To add the base URL plus the new date query on the string.
Perfect. All right. So we actually don't need to do much here. Let me show you how we can do this. If this URL is changing, right now our URL is just a part of our query function. But what we could do instead is we can use this URL to create different queries. And the way we do that is with a complex query key. So I know we have our image of the day key here, but we're going to do something kind of cool, is we're going to turn this into an array. Mm-hmm. And we're going to, all of these are going to be apods, but we're going to use the URL as the second part of the key. And that way, for every individual URL, we're going to get a different query entry in our query cache. So by adding the URL here, it's important now that we make sure we're using the right URL here. Well, let me show you something else that we're going to do to make this a little easier. We're going to take that function out and call this fetch apod. And let's just bring it up here. And it's going to be async. So if this is a different function, one thing that you'll notice is that this URL is no longer in scope here. But it's being passed to our query key, so we can actually use it in our function up here. Every part of the query key gets passed to fetch apod, this function. So if we come up here, come up to the top, yeah, fetch apod, we're going to be getting each part of the array key right here as parameters. So that first one is just the apod string. So it's literally like apod, you know, and we don't really have much of use for that. So we're just gonna like call it nothing. Sometimes I'll call it key or whatever. But that second part of the URL of the key is the URL that we want. And so we can actually take that URL and use it in our fetcher.
Oh, that's cool.
That's really cool.
So now, you know, your query keys aren't just query keys, but they also serve as variables for this function. So anything you're passing into the query key can also be used in the function that you're calling it with. So now that we're using our URL and it's getting passed to the fetch apod function, that's the URL that it's going to fetch. This should just work. If we save it, and let's get rid of our superfluous sail time 0, come back to the site. And let's open DevTools as well, if we can.
Is there a way to minimize it or move it down?
Currently not yet.
Okay, I've got overflow hidden, so I can't scroll.
You can just close it then, and we can look at it later. But go ahead and change the date, and let's just see what happens.
Nice. That's so cool.
And then let's go back to the date that we were on before.
Oh, you know what happened? It doesn't initialize as 617, but this one will.
There we go. So you see that there was no loading screen right there. There wasn't the spinning Saturn.
Nice.
And that's because we have those queries cached in our query cache. So if you open up DevTools now, you'll see that in the DevTools. So those gray ones right there, those are inactive queries. And inactive just means that we don't have any use queries or instances rendered on the page that are using that data, but we still have them cached. And that's where the cache time comes in. Not the stale time, but there's another one called cache time. That's how long you hold on to data after it's no longer being used in your application. And by default, that's set to 5 minutes. So if we were to stick around for 5 minutes, those 3 inactive queries would kind of just drop off.
It's beautiful.
That's awesome. And the reason the first one didn't work is we don't initialize it with the date.
Yeah.
So it was actually a different query.
Yeah.
When we went back to it.
I love that. That's such a nice feature.
Yeah, so when you go back to a query that is cached, in long-term storage, it kind of brings it back to life and shows you immediately, but goes and fetches in the background. And I actually think that's one last thing that we could do before we kind of start wrapping things up, I guess.
Sure.
Is if we go back to app and look at where we're actually rendering everything right here. There's a difference here between status loading and fetching. So status loading, really what that means is that we don't have any data to show and we're currently loading. But you'll notice that sometimes when you go to a query that's already been cached, you'll see the data immediately. You'll see this rendered, but it's still fetching in the background. It's going and getting the new version of it, and you just don't see it, right? And you can let your users know that that's happening using the isFetching flag. So if you come up here, we can use isFetching, which is separate from status, right? And we can use it inside of this section where we have the data, but we might be background fetching. And let me show you what that looks like. I'm not sure where we can put it, but I'm just going to put it right here and say, if we're fetching, show some loading dots. Otherwise, show null.
Okay, so we'll go back
Nice.
to the app. We're fetching that data. Let's go back to 6:15.
That's the first time we loaded it, so we see the static. Go back to, yeah, and then we'll go back to 6:15. You'll see it immediately, but you'll notice that the loading right there in the background.
Very cool.
And that's
Yeah,
the
that's
background happening, going to fetch the new data. And when it finishes, it just invisibly replaces the old data with the new data. But only if they're different, actually. It does a diff there to see if the new data is different.
Nice.
really cool. Well, thank you so much. That was such an amazing demonstration on how on React Query, and this is just like scratching the surface, right? There's
Yeah.
use mutation if you want your data on in your UI to update when you've changed data. So really, I guess a good way that I kind of imagine this is, so far we've done GET requests, but what if we have the other CRUD operations, put, post, delete? React Query does give you lots of tools to handle those. And you can just find the use mutation. Oh, let's see, this is the DevTools one. And this to me was more exciting. I mean, the finding React Query, learning about caching and all of that was amazing. And then I found this, and it was like a second dose of excitement. It was really cool. Do you just want to talk about this real quick, and then we can be finished up?
Yeah, mutations are like a crucial part of most systems, right? If you're just reading data, use query is great, and caching and all that's fantastic. But really, when you start manipulating that data and changing it under the hood, and expecting your queries to update, that's where use mutation really comes into play. Really, it's similar to use query. It's just a wrapper that you stick around. You just wrap up functions that can change things on your data on your server. And then it lets you plug into life cycles of, did this mutation succeed or fail, or is it loading? And then using those life cycles, you can start to do some interesting things. Like one interesting thing you can do is optimistic updates. So you can actually make your app look like your mutations succeeded immediately, even though they're still happening on the server. And then when it comes back, if it's successful, then you can just keep that data around because it was successful. Or if it fails, you can revert back to the old data that you were showing before. Other nice things like this to-do list example, if you have a mutation to add a to-do, as soon as that to-do addition succeeds, you can tell all of the to-dos queries to go and refetch. Yeah, right there. So your mutations can start to dictate when your queries update. And then you don't need to rely as much on stale time and intervals and stuff like that. You can just have your mutations handle the life cycle, so that when one thing changes, you know that you need to refresh other things. Use mutation gives you the groundwork to do all that.
Ah, so cool. This is really exciting. Thank you so much, Tanner. I did have one question that came in on Twitch, if you have just one more minute.
I've got all the time you want.
Awesome. So Clint asked, can you talk a bit about how this relates to using sockets?
Yes, that is an awesome question, because I actually use sockets with React Query. At Nozzle, my company, we have the situation like you brought up earlier, Dustin, where we've got a lot of different people at different companies working on the same CRUD objects. So while you're looking at something on your app, somebody else on your team could be changing it on the server, and you wouldn't know about that, right? And it doesn't matter, intervals might take care of that, right? But it could be expensive to have all these intervals fetching all the time, and stale time doesn't really cover that as well. So what you can do is you can hook up WebSockets. And this involves setting things up on the back end a little bit. But the way that it works at Nozzle is we have a WebSocket for every single user that's logged into the system. And anytime that something changes in the system that has to do with that user, they get an event about it. So it could be like, hey, user, this to-do list was updated, right? It doesn't give them the new to-do list, but it just tells them that it was updated. We take that event on our front end and we say, if this event happens, we use the query cache refetch queries that you're looking at right there in the on success handler. Yeah, right there. We just call query cache.refetch queries and we say, go update the list that we just got a WebSocket notification about that it changed. So that way, as users are changing things, across the app, everybody is getting notified and updated automatically. And we don't have any intervals. We don't have any tricky stuff, just some WebSockets set up to notify our users of what CRUD objects were updated and what type of update it was.
Can I make a comparison here? And tell me if you feel like this is a fair comparison, but with React suspense and concurrent mode for data fetching, the way that concurrent mode simplifies loading states, it seems like React query simplifies caching and basically all of your API requests. Does that feel like a fair comparison?
Wow, I've never had it compared to something as monumental as like concurrent mode or suspense. But I mean, yes, in spirit, React query's purpose is to make caching and cache invalidation and synchronization of server state into your app a no-brainer, easy thing to do. It's really all about state synchronization, server state synchronization.
Yeah, and the reason I make that comparison is I've built cache systems on my own. It's a mess. It's horrible. I've built tried to handle all the loading states like concurrent mode takes care of, and then I find React query, and it really was when I first saw concurrent mode, I was like, this is amazing. You take care of all the work for me. I used to do this all manually. Awesome. Same with React query. The reason I made that comparison is it's amazing. You do all the work for that state synchronization, the caching, and just make it so simple. So that's how I connected those.
Oh, thanks. I think that's accurate. At least for me too, when I installed React query and migrated my own projects over to it, I felt that same joy of just deleting entire files and deleting entire blocks of code, losing thousands of lines of code across all of my projects. And not only did it do the same thing, but it did it better. And that's really why I was just as excited as any of you were about React query.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you very much, Tanner. Thanks, Nate, for joining as co-host today. And please follow Tanner on Twitter. And then again, check out his sponsorship page for React query. Appreciate you stopping by. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take it easy.
Tanner.
See ya.